System 1 and System 2, the two modes of thinking that we've been talking about, aren't literally parts of our brain or little two people in our heads telling us things to do. They're just useful models to think about thinking. Then, what would it be like if we were able to observe somebody from the outside and be able to figure out whether they're using System 1 or System 2 right now? Effectively mind reading them. To get a first-hand experience of this, ask someone you know to perform two-digit multiplication in their heads and look into their eyes, don't be creepy, and observe what you see. Now, for a long time, pupils have been associated with attractiveness. You take two photos of the same person, show to people, they rate the one where the pupils are dilated to be more attractive. But it turns out that pupils actually have a direct correlation to the amount of mental effort that you're exerting right now. The more the pupils dilated, the more mental effort you're exerting. What's even more interesting is that maybe when you're performing a task like two-digit multiplication and your effort level increases, your pupil size traces the amount of mental effort you're putting. It peaks and reaches its maximum size when you're trying to hold the maximum amount of things in your mind, when you're maybe at the peak of your mental effort. And it comes back to natural size, constricted, after you deload your working memory because you have the answer and you don't have to remember those numbers that you held in your memory anymore. This must mean that your pupils are little windows into your own brain activity. Scientists wanted to see which tasks in particular are the most taxing for your brain. In other words, the most pupil dilating. It turns out that our working memory is really the bottleneck when it comes to thinking. So tasks that involve holding 4 or 5 individual chunks in our working memory, or doing things under a pretty strict time constraint, or juggling between tasks really quickly, require huge mental effort and are notorious pupil dilators. And as you might expect, the more you perform an activity, the mental effort required to perform it the next time reduces, and the pupils as well react to this by not dilating too much when you perform the task. What stood out is that the amount of mental effort you put for a given task is fairly constant. In other words, you get to pick which task to indulge in, but you don't get to pick how much effort to put for it consciously. Your brain decides that. So if I were to walk up to you and say, here's a multiplication problem, I have a gun with me, and I'm going to shoot you in the mouth, and I mean it if you get the answer wrong, that does not change how much effort your brain decides to put into that activity. And now that is crazy if you think about it, right? In this sense, the tasks that you give your brain are like appliances that come with their own power rating. You can decide consciously whether you want to plug that device in or not, but you can't decide how much power it draws from your system. Luckily, the electrical supply metaphor doesn't extend too far, which means that when you do give your brain a task that's too difficult, taxes its working memory a lot, it doesn't just shut down the entire brain, like a supply just strips the entire system. It just takes that task out and deloads the memory for it. In other words, you give up on that task. It would be pretty hilarious though if our brain did work that way. This would mean that if the math problem got really hard, I would just pass out. Perhaps the most subtle, but also the most striking observation of these experiments is that after the experiment is over, your pupil goes back to being constricted and remains that way as you lead your life, having conversations, taking typical decisions. This means that for your brain, your daily activity and daily life feels like a stroll in the park unless you want it to feel like a sprint. It's as if how nowadays you don't really have to lift a heavy weight unless you consciously decide to work out. The fundamental idea here is that given an outcome that we want, and given many possible paths to get there, we are highly likely, many of us, to pick the path that requires the least effort, both mentally and physically. Now, this idea is really profound and fundamental, so fundamental that it has a name. It's called the law of least effort. In one sense, this is good news, because if you do want it to, life can feel like a stroll in the park, where System 1 gives you most of your decisions, it's easy, it's effortless, and it doesn't have to feel like a sprint where your System 2 is always scrutinizing what you're thinking. Isn't this what we wanted as a species? Comfort and ease? But there is also some bad news. And the bad news is that there are some activities that only your System 2 can perform exclusively, following specific sets of rules, putting together information from two different parts, and combining, contrasting, and analyzing them. Overruling your habitual decisions and intuitions are all System 2's domain. And unless you employ this deliberate, effortful, energy-sucking mode of thinking, your System 2 will be happy to let your System 1's intuitions pass by without scrutiny. You might meet 3 people and have bad experiences with all 3 of them, and it might happen that all 3 of them belong to the same community. And your System 1's intuitive part of your brain is shouting at you, stay away from this group, they are harmful. And this would pass by unchecked unless your System 2 steps in and decides to put this information of your 3 bad experiences together with another fact that this number 3 is statistically insignificant in comparison to the number of people who belong to that group. And then it infers that the best decision to take about this group is to take no decision at all until you have more information. This effortful, unnatural overruling of System 1 by System 2 when appropriate might be the closest we get to the definition of what it means to be a rational human being.